Yo, I'm Brendan. Today we're going to be talking about how much money you actually need to retire early, and this is the 2024 edition. Let's go. So this video came about because a friend of ours was asking us, how much do I actually need to retire early? And there's really two parts to this question. Part number one is, how do we even have enough money to retire in general? And part number two, which is potentially the trickier part, is how do we even retire early? Because that's a whole nother equation. Unless you sell your company for $100 million or you get a check from daddy every month, how do you retire before you're 65? How do you retire at all? And really, this is the answer to that question. Well, let's start by answering the first part of the question first, which is how much money do you need to retire? The main question here is how much money will you spend in retirement? And then how do we replace that amount of income? The good news is that most people only spend between 60 to 80% of the money that they do while they're still working. So let's say you make $100,000 now and you spend it all. When you retire, you'd only be spending between $60,000 and $80,000 a year, because typically when you're not working, you're not spending as much money, you're not driving as much, you're not buying new clothes, you're not doing all the things that you used to do. And so life gets cheaper, which is great. So that's one easy place for us to start. Quick spreadsheet for an example, just so we can visualize this and really get this concrete in our mind before we move on to the actual total that we need to retire. So let's say that you spend 100 grand now, you need about 75,000 in retirement. You spend 75 now, you'll need about 56 in retirement. Or if you spend about $50,000 a year now, you probably need to factor in to have about 37.5 every year so you can spend it in retirement. So now that we figured out that we don't need all the same money that we make now once we retire, how do we extrapolate that and figure out how do we retire? How much money do we need? What does this look like? Well, some people do this math and say, I just need to have this much money, this number that I spend in retirement every year, times the number of years I'm going to live, which isn't terrible math if we knew how long we would live.
But we've got real problems with this method because odds are you're going to end up with too much money saved. Yeah, there's a chance you don't end up with enough because you think you'll live to 90 and you pull a Brian Johnson, who kind of looks like a vampire anyway, and you live to be 200. That could be a problem too. But for most of us, maybe we want to be a little conservative, so we sock away a ton of money in the bank doing this method, and we end up with too much. The big problem here is you don't account for any kind of gains over time. So that means you're going to withdraw the same money every year. You're going to have a ton socked away, and this doesn't work. Which leads us to the next method, which is even more popular, but it's still wrong.
Somebody like Dave Ramsey at this point really diverges from the researched wisdom and from people like me's opinion, and that's fine because he's got his own opinion. A lot of his systems work really well, good for Dave, but what he suggests is a crazy 10% safe withdrawal rate. Basically, what Dave thinks you can do is have a lot less money invested than the common wisdom and still be able to make it. So let's get rid of our years left to live kind of calculation, and we'll go down here and I'll show you the math of the Dave Ramsey calculation and why that's still not enough money to retire early. So if we compare these methods, you see how much less Dave Ramsey thinks we need to retire. The person who's spending 100 grand per year probably only needs to factor in 75 grand per year in income in retirement. But according to Dave Ramsey, they only need $750,000 invested to retire right now, which is totally crazy. It gets even more attainable for the person who's currently spending about 50 grand per year. They'll need less in retirement. Dave says they only need about $375 invested to retire. By Dave's numbers, I could basically retire right now and never run out of money for the rest of my life. And the way that we got to these numbers is Dave has said basically, if you have X dollars invested, you can take 10% of that per year, every year, no matter what, for the rest of all time and never run out of money. Because if the stock market makes more than 10% and you only take 10%, you're good to go. The problem with Dave's method, especially in the first few years whenever you're retiring early, is what's called sequence of return risk. So not only is that withdrawing a huge amount of the money you have invested every year, which means there's less there to grow, it also means in terms of sequence of return that in the first year or two, if you have a bad stock market year, then you're really sunk. The first couple of years really determine the trajectory of your retirement in terms of your returns in the stock market. And so if you have the first year, 2, 3 years with not very good returns, this plan won't work. The numbers don't pencil out, Dave. It's not going to happen. And granted, Dave is a multi-hundred millionaire, and I'm just a guy here making YouTube videos, but the numbers don't pencil out. If you want more information about this and you want to see some kind of background, backup articles where people have done the actual math, look up the Trinity study or look for a couple of sources that I'll put in the description. It will back up this claim that I have. All right, so the Dave Ramsey method clearly is not the best idea. So what is the actual method that we need to use to figure out how much money we need to retire, especially if we're retiring early? Well, if we're just doing a standard retirement, not even an early retirement, which is even a trickier thing, we can follow what's called the 25X rule. Typically, people refer to this whenever they talk about the Trinity study or the 4% safe withdrawal rate rule. I'm going to call it the 25X rule just because it sounds like something different and new. I also like calling it the 25X rule because it's easier for you to remember. So what you do is you take the amount of money that you need in retirement every year as income and you multiply it by 25. So for this person who needs 75 grand per year every year just to spend, to stay alive, to have a good life in retirement, we take that amount, multiply it by 25, and now you get this total of 1.875 million. So with the 25X method, you actually need a lot more money than Dave Ramsey recommends because it's a much safer withdrawal rate. It's a much safer amount to take out every year because basically what it's saying is every year you can take out about 4% of what you have invested. As long as you have it invested mostly in stocks in the stock market that are really well diversified. We're not picking out individual stocks here and there. We're not in something like all bonds. We're in something like an S&P 500 index fund, or we're in something like a total stock market index fund, something that's got hundreds or thousands of stocks in it, really well diversified, really low fees. As long as you're investing in that way, then you can withdraw 4% per year and never run out of money. Dave Ramsey basically recommends that you're investing in something very similar, but he says you can take out 10% per year. So he's basically saying you can have a giant portion of your portfolio every year and be fine. That's not what the data recommends. The 25X method is less than half of what Dave recommends, and that means you need basically double the amount invested. Somehow the way I said that last thing seems kind of counterintuitive, but that's the way it is. The safer your withdrawal rate, the less money that you're willing to withdraw every year, the more money you have to have invested. Because think of it this way, you're taking a smaller piece of the pie. Let's say you want to have 100 calories worth of pie, which is probably like a bite. Let's say it's 1,000 calories worth of pie because we're having a big piece here. One way or another, you want to have 1,000 calories worth of pie. What Dave Ramsey is saying is you only need a little pie like this big because you're going to take a tenth out of it every year. Well, that proportionally, that's a big piece of the pie. What this 25X method is saying is that basically you need a huge pie because you're only going to be allowed to take 4% of it every year. So proportionally, you're going to have most of your pie sitting there looking totally intact every year. The lowest it'll ever go down is 96% of whole because you're only taking out little tiny bites. Dave Ramsey's like, no, it's fine, man. Take giant bites. This is a weird analogy. This is probably not helping anybody. I just really like pie. If somehow the weird pie analogy resonated with you, then comment an emoji that's a little pie symbol. So this 25X method is typically what you would use if you are retiring normally. Retiring at a traditional age, you're not doing anything super early because the studies that back this up around the Trinity study and around other kind of safe withdrawal rate studies typically only extrapolate out about 30 years. So let's say you're retiring in your late 50s, early 60s, you're going to make it 30 years for sure. Per the data in the studies, per other caveats. This is not financial advice. I'm not promising anything to you. But we really mix up those variables when we say we want to retire early. Like, I want to retire at 42. Well, that's a lot longer to live. That's a lot longer to maintain your portfolio than these Trinity studies and other things have really forecasted for, because you're probably going to live longer than 30 years, hopefully, probably. You might live 50 more years. So we've got to factor in an even safer withdrawal rate yet so that it can last a longer amount of time. So we'll do one more version of it here on the spreadsheet and show you what kind of numbers you need to plan for if you want to retire early. And these are the kind of numbers that I've factored in personally for myself. So this is very near and dear to my heart, making this kind of quick and dirty spreadsheet for you, because these are the kind of numbers that I'll crunch over and over and just fall into a pit of spreadsheeting because it's so interesting to me. All right, so this nice, beautiful dark green was the standard retirement kind of timeline setup. Now this last one down here is going to be for the early birds, those of us that want to retire in our 30s, 40s, maybe early 50s. That still counts as early retirement. So what we want to do instead of the 25X method is something closer to a 33X method, or even maybe a 35X method if you want to be really safe. And what this is saying is the money that you're planning to spend in retirement every year, we'll keep going with the $75,000 number. This person who's going to spend 75 grand per year needs to have invested, like we talked about, 33 times their income. So instead of having 750 grand invested, like Dave says, the 33X method says you need almost 2.5 million invested. That is a lot more, granted, but it's also way safer. We're talking about early retirement here. We're saying maybe if you want to situate your life as such, you never even think about working again. You never have to think about your money. Maybe once per year you cut yourself a check, or once every 6 months you sell some investments and you basically say, hey, I'm going to take out this lump of money so I can pay my bills. And then you go back to living on your island in Fiji, or you go back to doing whatever you're doing, building model trains, or, whatever your hobby is. For me, I'd probably be volunteering at a racetrack, eating a carne asada burrito every day, taking lots of photos of cool cars, going on runs with my family, basic stuff. Yeah, that makes my expenses seem really low in retirement. The carne asada burrito and getting to the racetrack would be the two most expensive parts. So if you want a version of this that you can see, I'll actually link to this exact spreadsheet that I just made with you right now so that you can reference that later on. What you're going to have to do, because this is Google Sheets, is make a copy for yourself. So whenever you look at this in there, you're going to go to File, Make a Copy, and then it will duplicate this exact spreadsheet with all the formulas and all the formatting and everything, just as it is that you see right here, into your own Google account. So don't request edit access from me. If it says, hey, you're trying to edit this, request edit access from the owner, from Brendan, and I'll say, no, you're not going to edit everyone's. This is like the baseline for everybody. So just go to File, Make a Copy. You get your own totally for free. You don't have to sign up for my newsletter or anything. I have a newsletter, but you don't have to sign up for it to get this. I think this is sort of a fascinating question for everybody. We all sometimes wonder, like, how does somebody retire early? Unless you sell your company for $100 million or you get a check from daddy every month, how do you retire before you're 65? How do you retire at all? And really, this is kind of the answer to that question. You have this, albeit giant nest egg, invested well, invested really diversely, and then you just take a tiny little bite out of it every year. That's kind of it. So in some ways, that's really simple. In other ways, that then begs the question, how the hell do you get that much money? How do you amass $2.4 million? The average 401k balance is way less than that. Let's look it up right now. So thank you, Investopedia, for this article. The average 401k balance by age is paltry compared to what we actually need here. For 20-somethings, they've got 10 grand. For 40-somethings, not quite 100. Even people in their traditional retirement age have less than 200,000 on average. And I'm over here claiming that to retire early or to retire, you need millions and millions of dollars. The reality is that most people aren't set up to retire with anything close to the kind of income that they had when they were working. And so for me to claim that you're going to need or want 75% of the income that you had while you're working is actually like luxury status. I mean, you're ahead of 90+% of other retirees, because when you're retiring with 200 grand in a 401k, maybe 10 or 15 grand in an IRA, you've got 30 grand in the bank and a paid off house. That's nice, but that's not going to replace your income. Even if you're making 50 or 60 grand per year, what are you talking, 3 or 4 years? So right now, the reality of most people's retirement situation is they really rely on Social Security. And then they end up doing some interesting things like a reverse mortgage, or they continue to work part-time or something else to kind of make ends meet, because we don't save enough to retire. That's the bottom line for Americans today, period. Do you absolutely have to have $2.4 million to retire? I don't think so. I mean, people are doing it with less, but they're selling their house, they're selling their cars, they're really reducing their lifestyle to a degree that they can pay for that with Social Security, with a little part-time work here and there, and withdrawing a little bit from savings. People are going from a middle-class standard of living to very, very, very cheap just to kind of keep the lights on. So if you're watching this and you're 55 or 60 or 65, you're probably not interested in early retirement anyway, because we're kind of past the early stage. But at that point, you don't have enough time to really rely on compound interest to build you this kind of net worth. And so at this point, you're really trying to figure out how to cut back your expenses, how to keep your investments producing income, or at least growing at a rate that makes sense that you can withdraw from it. It doesn't necessarily have to produce income. It just needs to be stout enough and grow enough that you can withdraw a chunk of money from it and create your own income. You don't need it to pay you. You don't have to have whole life insurance or an annuity or dividends. You can just withdraw some money. So that's a little clarity there for you. For those of us who are Gen X, Gen Z, millennial, on the younger side of things, 45 and younger or so, we do have a lot of time left for compound interest to really come into play here. But what we need to do is invest as much as we can, as early as we can, because if you're 26, yeah, you're not making the most money you'll ever make in your life, but you investing today and getting that ball started and getting the compound interest machine rolling for you really makes those numbers I just laid out possible. You could potentially have a really cushy, incredible retirement if you get investing now. If you get started now and get really aggressive, then maybe you can travel for your whole retirement. If you want to go to trips to Italy every other month, you could do that. Versus some other friends are going to be like, yeah, I can't even afford to go to Mexico, even though it's only a 5-hour drive. I just can't make it happen, man. I have no money. I mean, That's the difference between the choices you make in your 20s and 30s versus being stuck with a situation in your 60s. And I know just how demoralizing that is whenever you're 23 and you start investing and you're like, dude, it took me 4 months to get $1,000 in this account. And I'm like investing as hard as I possibly can. I'm like eating ramen so I can even invest. And all I have is $1,000 to show for it. Like, I'm so far from that $2.4 million number. I get that. I'm totally with you in that. But the truth is that the slow start is better than never starting, or it's better than starting quickly, but whenever you're later on down the road. You know, if you're making 200 grand a year and you're 50 years old and you start investing heavily then, that's good. It's way better than nothing. But compared to what you're doing now as a 20-something, it's kind of too late. You know, I would rather you invest $200 a month at 26 than $2,000 a month when you're 50, because you're going to end up with a ton more money. I'm not allowed to cuss. A shit ton more money. A crazy amount more money because you've started investing earlier. The most important thing we can do is invest as early as possible and avoid fees and be really well diversified. There's another video about this that I made that are the most important things to remember whenever you're getting started investing. I'll link it right here, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.